Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest, David Danelo, is the director of field research for the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an adjunct professor at the University of Texas at El Paso's National Security Studies Institute. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and served 7 years as an infantry officer in the Marine Corps. He's also an author, and his latest book is called The Field Researcher's Handbook, a guide to the art and science of professional fieldwork, published by Georgetown University Press. When he wrote the book, David Danelo relied on his experience in the military as well as his subsequent work with the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol to inform his approach to fieldwork. The result is a very approachable book that at its heart advocates for getting outside to conduct research. That may sound obvious, but it's easier than ever, after all, to conduct some kinds of research without ever leaving the office. David outlines the protocol for conducting field research, but he also delves into the art and science of it too, which results in a title that helps explain the practice of field research for a broad range of readers. In this second episode of our four-part series, David and I talk about the more creative elements of field research and how bias and positionality can have an impact on what you take away from fieldwork. So I think one of the points you're making in the book is that there's a sort of an element of protocol to conducting field research, but you also note there's an art and science to it too. What can be some of the more artistic or creative approaches to conducting field research, particularly the ones that are sort of beyond that classroom style experience?
I think so. It's easier for me to talk about the artistic stuff and more fun, but I'll start the response to this question by noting some of the science and the tactics, because I think those are the more interesting type, like how do you practice field research? For example, I have a colleague with the Global Initiative who is an exceptional typer and interviews very well while typing. And I'm really impressed with this particular individual's capacity to do that and have attempted to learn and replicate it. And I simply don't do it as well.
Right.
I tend to do more dialogue. It means I have less to roll up that is immediately typed content in the company file on any particular subject that we're working with. And this individual I've learned from has an ability to just kind of put people at ease while they do it. They can just be like, "Hey, yeah, are you?" And that's not something I have done as well. I've tended to, in my field research, been more going back to the science of it. For me, it's been, build the rapport, go back, take the notes later, come back, maybe do something a little bit more formal once a rapport is built. Maybe if I can build the rapport quickly enough to get another contact, then use that to get another contact. Mm-hmm. And that's just how I've worked with it. So for me, that the art has been interacting with the situation, interacting with the relationship, basing my own ability to relate, whether it's if I know the language well, if my body language is positive enough, if there's enough rapport built up with someone doing translation, if I have a clear understanding of all the different variables involved and I can proceed on and I can do that, then I go ahead. But I have learned science skills that others use well. You just kind of pick and choose from them in your toolkit. And so for me, I think that's the art. So going back to my colleague, if that individual tried to be me and relate the same way that I do with certain groups of people, whether that's maybe former military or law enforcement, or maybe current policymakers in government, it would come from a different. There would be a different vibe to it, and so right. I might be able to establish those relationships quicker, get some other contacts quicker, get some other lines of inquiry quicker. But I mean, my colleague can just roll up content exceptionally well, and they get good data quickly, and get it into a space where some of our qualitative analysts that aren't field workers but that do some really great quantitative analysts that do some great quantitative work can start crunching on that right away,
Right.
and that's not my skill set. So that I think the art is just knowing yourself well enough to understand what your skill sets are and how they relate in the field, and then the science is from that art identifying the tactic and applying it and doing it to skill.
Okay. You spent a good deal of time talking about in the book talking about bias and positionality and how that impacts field research. And I'm wondering if you could kind of walk us through the concepts of bias and positionality and how a good field researcher kind of comes to an understanding, I guess, of their own biases and minimizes those, and how that all kind of how that dynamic works once you're out in the field.
I think there's a lot to start with in terms of self awareness more
Hmm.
than anything, in terms of just discussing bias and positionality. We all come from the and that goes back to even before we're in the field. I mean,
Yeah.
the book talks about that. When if you grew up in the city, spend time in the country. If you grew up in we discuss it. For example, largely the book is written by design for an American audience. Georgetown University Press is an American publisher. It's generally consumed by Americans. However, it could be read and digested by any English speaking human being in its current form. It could certainly be translated, and if the Field Researcher's Handbook is produced in the German edition and you're reading it from Germany, then there's a bias and positionality that you come from by virtue of having, grown up in Hamburg and gone to Berlin, on weekends or whatever however it is that your own experience has emerged in
Yeah.
your life, you're encountering wherever you go in the world through that background of
Hmm.
experience. And this actually, I've been reflecting on this recently. It was Veterans Day, and one of the things that I do with my friends on Veterans Day, and sometimes I have a chance to have a new conversation with individuals about this, and it's fun to do so. I enjoy celebrating the idea that we're all veterans of something, and
Right.
this goes back to bias and positionality because in the United States, of course, we've got this great military culture, or excuse me, I mean, it's a military culture too,
Yeah.
in certain ways, but we've got, this great culture of celebrating service and thanking veterans for service and things like that. And we're all products of certain experiences. And so whatever it is that we are veterans of, just as my own identity as a military veteran means, for example, I walk a certain way. I, I can't not walk the way that I walk because wherever I go in the world, I am going to walk like somebody who spent 11 years in a military uniform and 7 years in the Marine Corps,
Yep.
and that's the way it is. I
Uh-huh.
will walk like someone who graduated from the Naval Academy who was a captain in the Marine Corps. I just do. I can't if I try to get that out of me, it's unnatural. But I have to be aware of that. It benefits me as a field researcher to be aware of that. It benefits me to understand that people who encounter me might be intimidated by that, or they might experience that in a different way than I intended to come across. So yeah, I think that's it's critical to understanding the idea of bias and positionality because at least we you aren't necessarily going to change who you are, but you can use who you are to your maximum advantage in collecting data. And I think that that's what a field researcher's job is and what good field researchers do.
Yeah. I mean, are there situations though where you can kind of enhance those qualities about yourself, but also maybe need to suppress them in certain ways, depending on the situation at hand? And I would guess what I'm looking for here is where my bias or positionality, how they actually impact the practice of conducting the field research, either in a positive or potentially
Let me give you a couple
hinder it. Yeah.
for examples and some lessons that I learned early on. So in
Perfect.
2007, in that experience that I was talking about on the U.S.-Mexico border, when I had a chance to go down to do some research for what became my second book, initially I was doing a magazine article, and
Right.
what was supposed to be the signature immigration bill of then President Bush's second term. And I was traveling the entire U.S.-Mexico border in May of 2007, a journey that's now been taken many times by many journalists for essentially the same purpose of inquiry. But at that point in time, the idea was, well, the president's got this immigration agenda, so let's really see what's going on the border. Well, I was with a friend who had also spent time overseas and was working as my photographer. His time overseas had been entirely as a civilian. So he's, got a nice untucked shirt, he's casual, he's, relaxed, and I had a tucked in one of those old Under Armour shirts that, the green ones that stuck to your skin, and I was
Right.
in shape, and I had wraparound sunglasses, and, you know, we were walking towards a migrant shelter in El Paso, and there was a line of individuals that were lining up to meet with immigration attorneys. And when they saw me, they visibly jumped, like they were visibly startled, like you could see there was a ripple reaction to me. And my buddy looked at me and he was like, "We got to get you a new look." Basically, like, look, you're the cargo pants that you're wearing with that shirt are just not going well. So.
Right.
We took a stroll over to Walmart, got some shoes, got some jeans, got some shirts that looked a little more casual and a little bit more relaxed, untucked. Ditched the wraparound sunglasses, and just kind of had a sense of, okay, well, this is how I'm walking and how I'm wearing is really intimidating to the people that I want to go and talk to, and I'm not going for any purpose that would be harmful to them or their interests. If anything, I was intending to tell as much of their story compassionately as I could. They would allow me to. But that wasn't. I had to gain a sense of how I was coming across, and so I had to make changes once I realized that my own positionality wasn't well suited for that particular type of data collection. Some of it too, I think organizationally, not everybody can collect the same type of data. There's some things, I think I used the example of Margaret Mead in the book.
Yeah.
I could never do Margaret Mead's field research. It's simply not, no matter how much I try to compensate for my own bias and positionality, I will simply never get young Samoan women to tell me what they told Margaret Mead. They won't. They're not going to develop that relationship of trust with me. And organizationally, organizations who have a field research responsibility benefit from task organizing to the person.
Yeah.
Task organizing based on how somebody projects and what their own positionality says. So I think that's an important lesson learned for organizations evaluating field research.
Yeah, absolutely. You just heard from David Danelo, author of a new book published by Georgetown University Press called The Field Researcher's Handbook, a guide to the art and science of professional fieldwork. David is the Director of Field Research for the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an adjunct professor at the University of Texas at El Paso's National Security Studies Institute. Join us next week when David and I continue our conversation and talk about how to be an effective interviewer and the surprising difficulty of interpreting results of your own field research.
It kind of goes along with the irony of gaining new positionality, right? By virtue of having the experience of field research, you've now encountered something, you can walk away with more questions than answers because you've seen something in a new light. You've seen something through the lens of a different experience that you had not expected to encounter. And I think that the best way to handle that experience, because it's likely to occur, it's not almost it's not an if, it's a when.
Right.
Because simply by getting onto the ground and asking questions, you're going to end up in that category of unknown unknowns. You're going to find out things that you didn't know, which is what you're supposed to do.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's digital media specialist, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.